And Prof. Sabelo Ndlovu Gatsheni is the professor and chair of epistemologies of the Global South with emphasis on Africa at the University of Bayreuth in Germany. So we can't imagine better qualified people to give lectures on the themes of this conference than Prof. Ndlovu Gatsheni.
Thank you so much for inviting me to deliver a keynote address at this important conference themed Africa Knows. My name is Sabelo Ndlovu Gatsheni. I am a professor and the chair of epistemologies of the Global South at the University of Bayreuth in Germany. I'm also a member of the African Cluster for Excellence at the University of Bayreuth. The title of my keynote address is The Cognitive Empire in Africa, Knowledge, Consciousness, and Epistemic Freedom. This is an important subject which enables us to speak about the consequences of the cognitive empire for knowledge in Africa, for intellectual and academic consciousness, and the struggles for epistemic freedom. In this lecture, I'm inspired by the liberation icon Steve Bantu Biko, who posited that the potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And that argument intrigued me to inquire into how does the oppressor end up in possession of the mind of the oppressed and using that instrumentally to continue the oppression. And this led me to inquire into the subject of the cognitive empire. And to give a definition of the cognitive empire, I will actually speak about it in the context of two other empires which are well known, the physical empire and the commercial non-territorial empire. In short, the physical empire is one which physically conquers the people, administers them directly in a colonial way. The physical empire has provoked well-known struggles for political decolonization, which Kwame Nkrumah depicted as seeking the political kingdom. On the other end, the commercial empire is one which Kwame Nkrumah spoke about in terms of neo-colonialism, because it maintains itself through economic domination over those countries which have attained political independence. The commercial non-territorial empire invoked struggles for economic victory, symbolized poignantly by the demands for a new international economic order, and other initiatives such as the Lagos Plan of Action. What is not well known clearly is the cognitive empire. And this empire is the most important in the sense that it lays foundation for other iterations of the empire because it invades the mental universe of the world in general and the minds of the African people in particular. The novelist and African intellectual Gugu Thiong'o termed it the metaphysical empire. The historian Robert Gilder called it the empire of the mind. And the Indian psychologist and the intellectual Ashish Nadi termed it the intimate enemy. It is this cognitive empire which enabled what Nelson Maldonado Torres termed coloniality of being. That is, the colonization of being human itself through the social classification of human population and the racial hierarchization in accordance with the inverted differential ontological densities. This serves an important purpose in identifying those who have been removed from the human family through classification and the racial hierarchization into targets of genocide, enslavement, colonization in its physical, economic, cultural, and mental dimensions. The colonization of being human and its redefinition in racial terms is an essential requisite for coloniality of knowledge, because those who have been socially classified and racially defined as subhumans, as black, as brown, are automatically said to be without knowledge, without history, without civilization, without development, and all other features attributed to being human. It achieves this through a number of techniques, including the theft of history, whereby the history of humanity in its entirety is appropriated by a particular people from one province and they make it their own history, and then they give it to the world as European artifact. It also operates through committing epistemicides, the killing of other people's knowledges, linguicides, the killing of other people's languages, and the culturecides, the killing of other people's cultures. Goth identified the two techniques used by the cognitive empire in its invasion and the colonization of the mental universe of its target. The first one, he used the example of programming of a computer as a metaphor for how the cognitive empire colonizes the minds of African people. He says it removes the hard disk of previous knowledge and memory and then downloads into the minds of the colonized the software of European knowledge and memory. Secondly, he used the example of a bomb, the cultural bomb, which he said is detonated at the center of the world of the colonized, resulting in them losing confidence in their names, in their languages, in their histories, in their cultures, in their struggles for liberation, and eventually in themselves. The major result of the invasion of the mental universe of the colonized is what is known as alienation from one's culture, from one's knowledge, from one's history, and indeed from one's self. Alienation results in what the Black American sociologist William E.P. Du Bois termed double consciousness, what the Martinican revolutionary Frantz Fanon termed pitfalls of consciousness, and what the African leading scholar Al Mazrui termed cultural schizophrenia. The key manifestation of alienation and the pitfalls of consciousness is an apparent disconnect between social location and the epistemic location in one's locus of enunciation. This is why one finds some scholars, some African scholars who are socially located in the subaltern side of power, but writing as though they are on the privileged side of the modern colonial power spectrum. This is partly because, as African intellectuals, they are produced by the same problematic institutions, particularly the modern westernized universities, that are part of the modern world system that is racially ordered and configured to the extent of always alienating the Africans. The consequences are that African intellectuals end up with four tough choices. Either the first one is either they assimilate, radically emulate what has been imposed by the cognitive empire. The second one is either they actually exist in a very problematic space, a liminal space in between, and being in a perpetual limbo. The third is that they react with radical alterity, trying to delink, which sometimes lead them into nativism, into negritude, and ghettoization. And today, we are all facing the resurgent and insurgent struggles of decolonizing the mind, which aims at undoing what the cognitive empire did to African minds. These tough choices takes us to the current conjecture characterized indeed by the resurgent decolonization struggles and the demands for epistemic freedom. What I can say is that since the colonial encounters, African people have been resisting the cognitive empire in various ways, despite the fact that it tried to invade their mental universe. African scholars have been actively involved in countering, opposing, resisting, and writing back. As far back as the 1860s, such African figures as Edward Wilmot Blyden, Castle Hayford, and many others have tried to actually agitate for African universities in Africa, African universities which privilege African knowledges and African languages. In the 1960s, African historians mounted one of the most effective challenge to imperial and colonial historiography. And the example of Cheikh Anta Diop from Senegal, who consistently and meticulously challenged Eurocentric historiography and used the case study of Egyptian civilization to counter uh, Eurocentric historiography, comes to the mind. At the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, a respected and robust African nationalist school of history emerged in the 1960s to challenge colonial historiography, including its methodology. As far back as 1968 and 1969, Ngugi wa Thiong'o and his colleagues at the University of Nairobi were mounting a direct challenge to the Department of English, calling for its abolition. In other words, calling for literatures which actually start with Kenya, which reflects African location, global South location, and ending with the European literature. In the 1970s, we also witnessed the growth of black Marxist political economy interventions represented by the University of Dar es Salaam and the respected Dar School, which was inhabited by such luminaries as Walter Rodney, with this emphasis on writing history from below and rupturing the iron cages of disciplinary knowledge. In 1973, the Council for the Development of Social Science in Africa, CODESRIA, was formed, and it has maintained an independent position in production of relevant knowledge to Africa despite its external funding. Such intellectual giants as Semia Amin, Mahmoud Mamdani, Archie Mafeche, Sem Moyo, Thandika Mkandawire, and the others are good representatives of the CODESRIA scholarship, which has privileged thinking about Africa from inside and capturing the knowledges of Africa. CODESRIA has survived even the moments of neoliberal assaults on African higher education and the turning of academics into neoliberal consultants and sycophants. Thus, when today we're talking about the resurgent and the insurgent decolonial struggles of the 21st century, we are actually talking about a younger generation picking up some of the perennial questions and challenges holding the knowledge domain in Africa. The cognitive empire is today being unmasked on a daily basis and challenged directly by such movements as the Rhodes Must Fall, the Black Lives Matter, as well as the students who are asking why is their curriculum white. At a global scale, there is increasing and indeed profound dissatisfaction by Eurocentric knowledge set afoot by the cognitive empire. It is this development that led me to write the book Epistemic Freedom in Africa, Deprovincializing and Decolonization in July 2018, capturing the mood of the continent that is fighting for intellectual sovereignty, self-definition, self-knowing, and the right to think. It was actually Steve Biko who said, "I write what I want," which is the clearest testament of an Africa that knows and is tired of being interpreted by others. Let me conclude by saying what has emerged since the 1960s is not an idea of Africa as presented by Mudimbe, but an African idea of Africa as captured by Ngugi wa Thiong'o. An idea which also links to what Nkrumah presented as, I was born, Africa was born in me, and I was not born in Africa. And all this, to me, indicate an Africa which actually knows, but is actually burdened by the cognitive empire. I thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
We've all enjoyed, I think, your very thought-provoking and powerful speech. And we have some questions already. We will start with a question from Bert. I've seen the presentation of profound importance. Prof mentions the importance of African languages. What is his opinion about the continued use of colonial languages as a medium of instruction in African higher education? Should we take them one at a time, or do you want a few?
Maybe let's take about 3 questions.
That is correct. Second point, as a scholar who's moved from Africa to the European context, how do you plan to stay focused on the African research questions while navigating the politics of the European academic context? For example, by applying to funders and all these dynamics of academia. And then the third one, thank you, your argument is well taken, but can you please elaborate a little bit on how decolonization of mind can be brought about? What does that mean for African studies or for science? So those are easy questions to start with, I think.
I doubt whether they are easy, but I think what I can say, they are important questions. Important in the sense that the question of language is always been haunting us for some time. And it is one reason why I chose to speak about the cognitive empire, because what the cognitive empire does is that it tends to introduce other languages, which then overshadow, if not displace, or if not kill, the other languages which the people, the majority of the people use. And the major issue being that I was thinking more from a university perspective, where in Africa we are still using colonial languages, and the challenge is how do we bring in indigenous African languages into the academy, and the issue being that indeed they are spoken in society, but intellectuals, academics, because of being part of the modern westernized university, they speak another language which is disconnected from the societies. And our challenge at the moment is really to reconnect. And I've been working in the Vice Chancellor's office at the University of South Africa to deal exactly with that question. And it is not an easy question, because it is resisted by the people, even the people who are supposed to be beneficiaries, who come from those same societies. They seem now to have liked these other languages to the extent that they think African languages cannot actually be languages of instruction, of research, and of science. And the core, how do we change it? We need to first of all change the mentalities which actually look down at other languages as not languages of science. And the other languages are the same. The very fact that one can argue that there are no vocabularies to name other things, it means the language was actually starved of being used to the extent that it lost. But as long as you begin to use it, it begins to generate new vocabularies which are being used. And the beauty of it, particularly from the environment which I know, which is South Africa, there are already vocabularies which have been developed. And the issue is just to bring those into the academy, into the teaching, into the research, and indeed into the academic space in a very formal way. Of course, there is always resistance, but we need to not to then give up because of resistance. We need to continue pushing. And the final thing which I want to say from experience is that we, at the University of South Africa, we even went to the extent of translating all the exam papers into the 11 indigenous languages. And that was a move to try and bring those languages into the university, though albeit in a very instrumentalistic way. But those are not minor moves in trying to bring the African languages into the space. And we were actually introducing 2 modules which actually make sure that everyone who actually works in the university where I was working is supposed to do 2 or so African languages. So there is movement in that direction. Then the second question, which relates to my movement from Africa to Germany, or movement from Africa to Europe, if I can put it that way. I think, again, in this keynote address, I tried to distinguish 2 issues: social location and the epistemic location. Most often, let's not confuse the geographical location of a person with the epistemic location of the person. I am still committed to the African agenda of decolonization, irrespective of where I'm located geographically, because I never lost the epistemic location of what I want to deliver. So there's no fear really that finally I've actually maybe been co-opted into the cognitive empire, into the belly of the cognitive empire itself. No, not at all. I'm coming into the space with both eyes open. But I think the question, the most important part of the question is how are we then going to navigate the fundings and all this. I learned from one of my senior colleagues, Professor Bonaventura de Santos, that indeed you need to fulfill the requirements of the funder, but after that you need also to make sure that you do what you intended to do. And those are the techniques which we use. I'm no longer sure what was the third question about decolonization.
The third question was, can you please elaborate a little bit on how decolonization of the mind can be brought about, and what does it mean for African studies?
Yeah. It's another important question, because at the moment we are dealing with it abstractly, and I think the question is actually asking us to then say practically, what do you do? One of the experiences which I had was that who is supposed to be decolonized? And I think unless we answer that, the professoriate itself is the one which is colonized. And what happens is it takes us back to the Marxist question, or Karl Marxist question: who will educate the educator? And the issue is the educator, because comes from the same institutions which is trying to critique. The educator is actually implicated, if not complicit, in coloniality. So what do we do is that what we do practically, we need to move from miseducation to re-education. And that is not an easy process. It needs really to expose the intellectuals ourselves deliberately to the complex politics of knowledge. And in the university where I was working, we proposed that we actually introduce a retraining of the academics themselves. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean that they don't know. They are well-educated people, they have knowledge. But what we want to do is to expose them to the complex politics of knowledge, so that they can actually be ashamed of some of the things they are doing in terms of curriculum development, whereby the same curriculum of a professor is only dead white men in the reading list. And that the person cannot see that it's a problem unless you expose the actual politics of knowledge. Thank you.
So we have, as I expected, quite a few questions. Why don't I give them all to you, and you can choose which one you answer and how you address them.
I think if we take three, is
precisely
and is better.
Yeah, precisely. One from Ton Dietz: African universities often have all four types. You talked about these four types of strategies for African academics, but African universities often have all four types. So how do critical African researchers of types 3 and 4, so if I remember correctly, the radical ones and the decolonizers of the mind, survive in Africa's universities that are composed of all these four? That's the first question.
Maybe that one I need to answer it directly before I get confused by the other. Of course, the majority are still in the radical assimilation or radical emulation mode. Others are actually in the most invidious position, the liminal space between I need to regain what I used to be, and I also need to be. That I think all of us will find ourselves. And these questions, the way we pose them, we must not pose them as though we're posing to somebody. We are posing them to ourselves as African intellectuals, because we are the ones. I'm talking to myself and to you simultaneously. So it's not really about me judging others and excluding me from this quagmire which were in the intellectual gridlock which were located in. So I will talk about my experience that the major issue is you want to be popular when you try to challenge and reconstitute knowledge. the knowledge which is dominant always naturalizes itself, it routinizes itself. And once it does that, it creates this issue that is impossible to have another knowledge. And we always face that. How I've moved through, one issue is what you cannot control. You cannot control what I write and what I read. So I do what I want, what I read, and I project into the world what I wish to be the transformative impulse which we need to carry. And somebody will quickly ask, but what are the challenges which you face when you try to do that? Of course, the outlets through which we disseminate the information also has all these gatekeepings, these traps and all that, trying to delay. But we have always said that if you want to challenge an existing, established, routinized, and naturalized knowledge, you don't expect it to be a walk in the park. There will always be challenges, and you need to be doubly rigorous, because the question they ask every time, you are ideological, you are polemic, you are angry, and those questions, before they accept your book or your article, you need to make sure that you really deal with them effectively, that even if they say, I disagree with you, but I don't question the intellectual rigor which is into this, what you've given us. And that's the way we communicate with the world. That is what the younger generation wants to read, so that they can see that it's possible to actually think otherwise, to rethink thinking itself. So I will speak about it that way.
Thank you very much. There are more questions. So just logistics, we're now running out of time, but the next session is a little late. So we have a few more minutes luckily to answer and address questions. So here they come. What approaches or concepts have so far, in your view, contributed to decolonize African minds? Question number 2, how did urbanism contribute to coloniality and furthering cognitive dissonance of the colonial matrix? And thirdly, thank you, Prof. You referred to initiatives in African higher education to privilege African languages and knowledges. Is there any university on the continent today that you would consider an African university in the sense, in that sense, rather than a university in Africa?
Okay. Maybe let me start with the last one about African university. I must actually be forthright on that one. So far, there is no African university. We have universities in Africa. I remember that in Uganda, there was a Marcus Garvey University, which was being established, and it was starved of everything. It was very hard to accredit the programs. So that's the challenge. So the issue is, we need not to confuse the whole issue of universities in Africa with African universities, bearing in mind that we are trying to talk about a university which takes its location very seriously. Its location very serious, not one which is located somewhere, but is still continuing with producing knowledges from elsewhere. So that is the challenge. The university are plenty. Some of them have even gave them vernacular names. Some of them are actually, most of them are actually a gift from African nationalism, but they never actually changed from the Eurocentric epistemological scaffold, if I would say. The changes which we've done so far is Africanization, whereby you then put Black professors into the positions, Black vice chancellors into the position, and then you increase access of Black students, African students into the university. But that does not go as far as changing really the canon. So the whole aspect of decolonization, there is a key element which, for lack of a better word, I will call decanonization. How do you decanonize what has been canonized, so that it then opens up for other knowledges? Because the question is not about knowledge. I think the idea of knowledge in the singular is wrong in itself. We need to be talking about knowledges, because the world is diverse. There are diverse knowledges, and we need to talk also about ecologies of knowledge. How do we bring different knowledges into the academy? Then the issue of the concepts. The concepts are many. We need to develop them. There is no tin somewhere
which is full of concepts where we draw from. And what we do, we always make the mistake of actually, even when we do the supervision, and what is your theoretical framework? And when you ask that, you are asking the young academic to actually look for theory somewhere, not to develop theory. So what this decolonization challenge which is upon us is actually inviting us to actually come up with concepts. I always envy the Latin American coloniality modernity school for coming up with the 3 units of analysis: coloniality of being, coloniality of knowledge, and the coloniality of power, which actually enable them to then think through the whole modern edifice, be it its intellectual, political, cultural. They use those 3, and they are expanding to coloniality of nature, coloniality of gender, coloniality of spiritualities. And we need to do that even for Africa, to come up with so many concepts. And indeed, already some African scholars have come up with concepts which we need to use. Nkrumah came up with the 2 important concepts, neocolonialism and conscientism. Al-Mazrui came with the concept triple heritage. All those concepts, we need to take them seriously, to test them like we test class and the other concepts. The very fact that we ignore those and they pretend that they don't exist, I don't think it makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Then the last round of questions, I think, for this one. Just recently, from an anonymous attendee, I heard the advice of a well-respected colleague to, rather than downgrading one's career by publishing in African journals, to enable all research partners in a given project to publish in high-ranking journals. What is, according to your thinking, the way to decolonize our minds and practices in respect to publication? It's an important question, indeed, for academics. Yeah. Can you please explain further how to read education within the structures of educational institutions marked by colonial legacies? Number 2, sorry. And then number 3, you spoke of double consciousness and other iterations, I think, of the idea of existing between different worlds as a result of historical circumstances often connected to oppression. Do you think that such an epistemic and indeed political positioning can be a starting point from which to engage and expose Eurocentrism?
Okay, they seem to be related, 3 related questions, beginning with the one on the important aspect of publications. I think one thing which we need to engage very carefully is that every time you raise the question of decolonizing knowledge, there is always this other counter argument which says, no, we are now living in a global political economy of knowledge. So if you continue to say African knowledge, Caribbean knowledge, Latin American knowledge, you are actually lagging behind. Now the in thing is really global economy of knowledge. And in that global economy of knowledge, what is always hidden is the continuation of an even intellectual division of labor, whereby theory is produced still in the global north, consumed voraciously in the global south. Secondly, intellectuals who are based in Africa and the other places, they are still, most of them, doing hunting and the gathering of raw data, which is then processed somewhere. And then there is the 4th aspect. If you want promotion, recognition, status, you need to know where to publish. And knowing where to publish, the presses, the so-called international journals, are located in the global north, North America, and mainly in Europe. And that up to today, you are actually navigating it. So the way you navigate it is to then think carefully about how do you resist while complying so that you continue resistance. The major problem is we need to invade those spaces and really make sure that we shake the things even in those journals. And how you do it obviously they will try to block you by so many means. It's not rigorous, it's ideological, as I said, and they will say all that. But it's important that we up our game so that when we intervene that somebody goes to sleep very angry, but he can't say your thing is not really up to standard. That's one. Two, the knowledges which we are actually calling for a standardized, westernized university, they still are considered subversive to the status quo. And as we all know, power concedes nothing without resistance. And we need really to devise many strategies. One of them is always this one of crowding out, coming into the center of what is Eurocentric. And while you are inside there, you need to do your decoloniality from the center. And that actually seems to work. The issue of consciousness, yeah, that one is a very difficult one. That's why I even put it as part of the subheading of my keynote address, because it is where the major problem is. Because unless you do a deliberate process of learning to unlearn in order to relearn, unlearning what colonialism imposed, and then you relearn anew, which is a very difficult. We always have a pedagogy of learning new things. We seem not to have a pedagogy of unlearning. How do you unlearn? And some people, when you speak about unlearning, they become very uncomfortable because what they've learned has become their identity. So it's in them. And they feel like if you say, no, but I think even Karl Marx had problems. If he's a Marxist, he will defend, or she will defend vehemently. And they say, no, you are actually attacking me when you do such type of a work. But it's all because of our consciousness. That's why I thought, let me share some views on the cognitive empire, because it invades the mental universe. And just imagine something which invades the mental universe. If it invades the mental universe, it becomes the basis, it changes everything. That's why Nguku wa Thiong'o uses this very vivid example of removal of the hard disk of the previous memory and the downloading into the mind, the software. We need to really look for a strong antivirus to actually remove that.
Thank you, Prof. We're getting many more questions. I'm also getting angry messages from the next panel, so we'll have to move on. But I've learned a lot, and I think everybody has it. It's been very thought-provoking. So I hope we can continue these discussions for the next months in some way or other. So thank you very much for coming in, and thank you for your intervention through the keynote.